All right, hi everybody. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it. First off, a little plug. As Paul mentioned, how many of you knew that there is an Englewood newspaper? Yeah! All right. Okay, me and Ellis Arnold right there. He is your Englewood reporter. Calling him out right now. Anyway, yes, you have a local newspaper. It is filled with unique and interesting information that you cannot find at any of the TV stations or anything else covering. So, a subscription is $30 a year. That's like lunch for two, and you get all your local news for a year, and we're accountable, and if you don't like something we wrote, our office is seriously like, it's Hampton and Gallipago, okay? You can come kick our asses personally. Anyhow, so tonight we're going to be discussing the 90th anniversary of a really terrible disaster that took place here in Englewood. This presentation is kind of two parts. The first part is the history of our biplane factory that we had here for a couple of years. That is it. If you are wondering where it was, that is the site today. We are like 75 feet from where this entire story took place. Also, raise your hand if you are drinking an Eagle Rock Pale Ale. Anybody? No? Okay, well it's on the menu. Oh, there's one. Okay, that's an Eagle Rock, that airplane. Okay, so, you know, we've got some other cool local history stuff up there. Sometimes I feel like me and a few gray-haired people are the only ones who get the names, but anyhow. So this is a project that Reed and I started a couple of years ago. We kind of added some new information, but wanted to touch on this as it's the 90th anniversary. But yeah, I will thank you all very much for coming, and I will hand this over to Reed.
A young man, full of himself and home for summer from military school in Tennessee, followed by his tag-along little brother, digs through their grandparents' dusty attic. The boys find old portraits, steamer trunks, furniture 30 years out of fashion. Then, from a corner, the little boy calls out to his brother that he's found something. Beneath an old blanket, a strange device. On filigreed legs, it has a cabinet, a kerosene burner and a wick, and a lens. In the cabinet, a box of translucent slides depicting images of the Holy Land. The older brother knows what it is. He runs downstairs to ask his grandfather for fuel. That Sunday night, in the balmy June heat of Keokuk, Iowa, they hang a white linen sheet from the storefront of the family shoe store. A crowd of a few dozen gather as the boys show images of the River Jordan, the Dead Sea, the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre. They repeat their performance every weekend that summer, and by August, the boys are charging local merchants to show advertising slides before the program. The boys were J. Don Alexander, age 16, and his 8-year-old brother, Don M. From this simple beginning grew a diverse commercial empire that led the field in film advertising, as well as holding mining interests, electrical mechanics, and a stab at the first coast-to-coast motel chain. Their film business, which essentially invented the notion of placing advertisements before movies, lasted until the 1960s. But the nadir of their fame and influence came in the late 1920s, when the Alexander brothers were among the pioneers of commercial aviation. On the banks of Englewood's Little Dry Creek, at the present site of the Trolley Square Shopping Center at Broadway and Floyd, hundreds of units of innovative Alexander Eagle Rock biplanes rolled out of the little factory and soared around the world. The genteel era that saw the Alexander Eagle Rock airplane become among the most popular flying machines of the day ended for the Englewood in dreadful disaster, with the charred bodies of young Englewoodians dragged from the factory, and with Alexander Industries fleeing in the middle of the night, never to return. The Alexander brothers were born in St. Louis in 1885 and 1893, respectively. A biography of J. Don describes their father as an able businessman and a successful railroad executive. The same biography describes their mother as a retiring, artistic, sweet-natured sort, and she believed in rearing her sons in that sheltered atmosphere that mothers are wont to foster. Details on Don M's early years are scarce, but J. Don is described as a child as frail, underdeveloped, and never in robust health, as a hothouse plant who could not stand the rigorous life of an ordinary boy. His father sent J. Don away to military school where, allegedly as a result of being repeatedly hazed by older boys, he developed into a forthright and capable young man. Family tragedy struck in J. Don's 18th year, Don M's 10th, when their father suddenly died at the age of 42. J. Don, supported by his father's insurance, moved to Spokane, Washington with his new wife Gertrude to work as an installer in the newly electrified city, while his brother remained at home. But by 1910, young Don M. had become quite a handful and was invited to move to Spokane with his older brother, where he was given the task of raising chickens under the auspices of the nascent Alexander Poultry Company. Don M. attended the School of Mines in Golden and was selected as a Rhodes Scholar with a free ride to Oxford, but was prevented from attending by the ongoing war in Europe. After taking a job as a cameraman with Pathé News, J. Don had the inspiration to reignite the cinema advertising scheme of their youth by producing commercials to play before films and local Nickelodeons. He started the Alexander Film Company in 1919. It was a family operation at first, with J. Don running the camera and heading the sales, Don M. producing, and Gertrude writing and directing the commercials themselves. The company struggled, showing first annual profits of $2.50. But soon, they were turning an ample enough profit that they needed a more central location to spread their business across the western United States. Their attention lighted on the growing town of Englewood, Colorado.
So by 1923, the brothers were looking for a more continentally central location for their burgeoning film business, and they found it on the grounds of the old Tuileries Amusement Park in Englewood. The site had it all: a gorgeous old mission-style dance hall that could be used as a soundstage, a meandering creek on sprawling grounds that made for lovely backdrops, and easy access to big city amenities in a small-town setting. Soon the brothers were in business at 3385 South Broadway, producing one-minute films for a bevy of clients nationwide. The films consisted of two parts: a 30-second playlet, a scenario with a brief storyline designed to act as a general-purpose lead-in for the second half, specifically tailored to business clients. A crew of 60 salesmen roamed the country, making their pitches to banks, car dealers, department stores, and more. In 1924, a year after the move to Englewood, J. Don had a brainstorm. Why not let his salesmen fly to their appointments? The country was flush with cheap war surplus biplanes, and the arrival of an airplane in a small town instantly drew excited crowds. The plan was that the Alexander brothers would buy up a fleet of planes and lease them to their sales crew. J. Don sent his sales manager, Justin McEnany, to the Nicholas Beasley Company of Missouri to learn to fly and bring home an airplane. While McEnany was away, the Alexanders bought up the 4 remaining biplanes of the short-lived Longren Company of Ohio and had them shipped unassembled to Englewood. A few months later, McEnany brought home not only an airplane, a 1920 Laird Swallow, but also 6 of Nicholas Beasley's staff to work for the Alexanders. When McEnany landed the Swallow at Lowry Field in May of 1925, J. Don took one look at the little plane and realized his men could build one themselves. The Alexanders never ended up selling a single plane to any of their film salesmen, but the Swallow became J. Don's personal flagship. You can actually see, it's a little tough to see, but it literally says President's Flagship right here on the table. Let's see here. The Longrens were pressed into service at a now long-gone airfield at Hampton in Monaco, where all the Alexanders' planes would take off in the hands of their new owners. The Swallow, with a 90-horsepower engine, felt underpowered in the thin Colorado air, though not nearly as scrawny as the half-ton Longren airplanes, each powered by a mere 60-horsepower engine. Dan Noonan, previously of Nicholas Beasley, was assigned to build the company's first plane. Noonan was not an aeronautical engineer. All he had done was modify the wings of old war surplus Jennies for Nicholas Beasley. But as the most experienced man on the crew, J. Don insisted he lead the charge of designing a new airframe. The plane Noonan designed was a sort of Frankenstein composed of parts of the Longrens and other locally available parts. The plane was named Eagle Rock, the rock part coming from the nearby Rocky Mountains, and the eagle part in honor of an eagle that had become an unofficial mascot of the company after injuring its wings on the trolley wires that once lined Broadway, right outside the door here. Side note, there's a little note in one of the histories that says the company employees took turns shooting rabbits along Little Dry Creek to feed the eagle. It died a few months later regardless. On September 18th, 1925, that is the day that this photo was taken. September 18th, 1925, the first Alexander airplane was complete and ready to fly. It was rolled onto the lawn where most of Englewood turned out to witness its christening. J. Don's wife, Gertrude, stepped up to break a champagne bottle on the nose of the ship, but succeeded only in bashing dents in the fragile aluminum nose cone. Workers removed the cone, and she finally busted the bottle across the plane's exposed propeller shaft. That night, the plane was towed to the Hampton airfield. Joe Hammer, snagged from Nicholas Beasley, was the first pilot. The big beast lumbered down the runway, barely climbed into the air, circled the field, and came back in for a landing hissing steam from the overheating engine. For the rest of the week, different engines and propellers were fitted to the plane, but nothing overcame the fact that the plane was overweight and underpowered. Still, J. Don had booked a slot to show his new creation at the Detroit Air Show and loaded his family and baggage aboard, only to have the plane unable to leave the ground. He skipped the air show. The problem was already well known to 19-year-old Al Mooney, a self-taught aircraft designer who had graduated only a year prior from South High School. Though J. Don had hired Al to build wing ribs, the young man knew full well that the heavy Longren clamps used to hold the fuselage together would keep the Eagle Rock forever grounded. Dan was heartbroken at the failure of the first plane, and Al drew up his own design sitting at his kitchen table, using slide rules, protractors, and all sorts of things like that they used at that time. He presented the design to J. Don, who reversed Al and Dan's roles, and Dan was assigned to build the airplane designed by his teenage underling. If there's any aviation buffs or pilots here, Al Mooney, later Mooney Aircraft, that's where he got his start. The plane was finished in January of 1926, and Al accompanied the plane out to the Hampton airfield. The day was so cold, J. Don didn't bother to attend. The teenager's plane soared into the sky, however, and Al rushed to a phone and howled for J. Don to step outside and watch the graceful flyover of the new ship. J. Don, ecstatic, leapt into his Pierce Arrow and barreled down Hampton to the airfield, arriving before the plane returned. He threw his arms around Al Mooney and thrust a pocket full of congratulatory cigars into the young man's hands. Soon the Alexander Industries building went full bore toward airplane manufacturing. That's J. Don and some of upper management of the company with the successful plane. There's J. Don. Most of the photos of him in the second half of his life, he's dressed like that. He was really playing the part. This is an interesting photo here. We'll get to this a little later. This is the building that blew up. We'll get to a little bit about the placement here in a bit. Here's a bunch of under construction Eagle Rocks. Reed and I went through this photo really close, widely blown up one time. There's quite a few of the people down here in the crowd ended up blown sky high not terribly long after this photo was taken. If you get in real close, you can start identifying some of the specific faces. Let's see here. New structures went up all over the grounds to be used for different elements of airplane building. Eagle Rocks went on sale with a variety of options. All right, that's going a little farther. Okay, there we go. Eagle Rocks went on sale with a variety of options. Most planes could be had for a little more than $2,000, which is about $28,000 today. An early plane went to Sid Grauman, owner of Grauman's Chinese Theater, who had the ship decked out with a paint job featuring a mean-looking snake. Film star Mary Pickford christened it with a quart of milk across the propeller. There we go. Sales exploded through 1926, and Denver hotels housed customers waiting for the completion of their planes. Alexander's struggled with the backlog. In December of 1926, J. Don was approached by young Charles Lindbergh, who only 6 months later would be the first to fly from New York to Paris. Lucky Lindy sought a special order plane to exacting specifications and wanted it delivered in only 2 months. Furthermore, the 25-year-old flyer wanted Alexander Industries to help sponsor his feat. J-Don turned him away, too overwhelmed by the backlog of orders to deal with the Lone Eagle's request. Lindbergh, of course, went on to have his Spirit of St. Louis built by the Ryan Company of California, though he maintained a friendship with the Alexander designers and visited Englewood again not long after his famous flight. Lindbergh's triumph fueled an explosion in civil aviation, and Eagle Rock sold like crazy. Floyd Clevenger, a 29-year-old flying instructor, joined the staff. He hosted flying lessons by radio show on KOA radio and taught a Rocky Mountain news reporter to fly. He took prospective buyers on air tours of Englewood's new subdivision stretching to the south and blanketed Denver with handbills for the Fritz Lang film Metropolis. Alexander Eagle Rocks began making their way around the country and the world. Will Rogers flew one to speaking engagements. The first airborne wedding was aboard an Eagle Rock. A department store in Fort Wayne, Indiana flew orders to little towns and farms in an Eagle Rock. A plane equipped with skis was pressed into service hunting wolves and coyotes in Wisconsin and was featured in National Geographic. Planes made their way to Canada, Mexico, South America, and China. In the midst of the post-Lindbergh boom, the federal government decided in the summer of 1927 that airplanes for the first time had to be inspected for safety and registered. With a few modifications to engines, structural integrity, and flying surfaces, the Eagle Rock easily passed. By September of 1927, a year and a half after Al Mooney's bird first flew, the Denver Post was printing rumors that the Alexanders were looking to move out of Englewood. The move was driven in part by space limitations at the Englewood plant, but also by fear that Denver would soon annex Englewood and bring higher taxes and increased adherence to fire and building codes that would cause great expense for the factory's loose collection of hastily built barns and sheds. Numerous cities bid for the Alexander plant, but Colorado Springs won out. I'm going to skip one here and go back to it. There we go. On December 6, 1927, the brothers officially announced that the company would move south in July. The Springs had convinced a local landowner to donate a horse racetrack and grounds for the site of the new factory, where the track would be used as a private airfield right out the front door. I'm going to pause here real quick and show you. This is an interesting little map here. This is from a 1927 fire insurance map. It's called the Sanborn Company Maps. They've got them of a bunch of different cities around Colorado. This is as close as I can get. I wish this showed a little more to the south and west, but that doesn't seem to exist. But this here, that is the Alexander plant. You remember I said how it's more or less on the footprint of King Soopers today. I think a good chunk of the building may have been more like in the parking, where the parking lot is now. Roughly, I mean, I think like Kaufman's Big and Tall would be right about here, I think. You know, and then whatever the other, Cafe 180 would be like right about here. These streets have shifted a bit. There's Floyd, there's Lincoln, there's Girard. You know, so here's Sherman over here, Broadway. This is a close-up. This is the main building. This is that big mission-style building. You know, you can see they've used the main dance hall. That was the film studio, woodworking shop. And, you know, and we had an old-timer here at the 2:30 presentation who suggested that, I wasn't quite clear on this, but this may in fact have been the building that blew up. It was called the Dope Shed. I made the joke earlier, I'm going to go ahead and make it again. There's still plenty of dope sheds in Englewood. I'll pause there. I'll say, we can get into this a little bit more later, but yeah, well, yeah, thank you, CJ. Yeah, so dope was a material composed. That's a sort of colloquialism for silver nitrate, which was used to paint on wing fabric in order to waterproof it. A similar substance was in use on model airplane wings well into the 60s and 70s, but it was unfortunately highly flammable. So let's see here. Let me see where we're at. Okay, all right, handing it back over to Reed here.
Just before noon, on April 20th, 1928, the Alexander Airplane Company was the Alexander Airplane Factory was humming with activity. Men and women hard at work preparing the day's orders. Out in the hot dope shed, a metal fan, malfunctioning, flashed off sparks that arced through the air into an open pan of silver nitrate dope. The liquid caught alight, and in the dope-fumigated room, an explosion ripped through the space. Within seconds, another and another explosion, and in under a minute, the whole building was roiling with flames. The Denver Post from that day reports, with the first explosion, flames shot 50 feet out of the building. Living torches came staggering out. Rescuers rushed into the inferno to emerge moments later, dragging seared bodies of men and women who had fallen in the fiery blast. Pieces of flesh dropped from some of the charred bodies as they were dragged out of the blazing building. Jack Nordstrom of 2005 South Gilpin Street crawled out alive, but with not a particle of living skin left on his body. People, their clothes and flesh alight, fled from the building and jumped into a nearby swimming pond left over from the Tuileries days. R. George Woods, a deputy sheriff, was at the Englewood fire station when he saw a cloud of smoke rise over the Alexander plant. 2 minutes later, the alarm came in, he said, and at about the same time, flames burst into the air over the plant. 2 more explosions followed as more inflammable chemicals were ignited inside the dope shed and the motor plant. The only way out of the back room where the seamstresses worked on the wings was through the flaming dope shed. FS Tast, employed at an auto dealership across the street, saw the explosion and came running to help. The Post reports that through a window on the north side, he saw a woman, her hair burned off, her face and arms horribly burned. Her arms encircled the bars across the window. She seemed to be unconscious. The bars had prevented her from escaping the flames. Task procured a pole and attempted to pry the bars, and a heavy screen tacked on the outside of the window, he said. But before he could get to the body, it had fallen back inside the building and was hidden from view by the flames. The 22-year-old assistant foreman, Carl Mosley, was near the exit when the flames erupted. Instead of fleeing, he ran deeper into the building to help get 3 men out. The Rocky Mountain News interviewed him in the hospital, with Mosley saying, "There was that first blast, and then another, and then maybe another. Then, oh God, it was awful." Mosley died moments after the interview. So did one of the men he tried to save. The fire department arrived with the buildings in inferno and a scene of utter horror before them. Some victims ran in circles, blinded. Some were so shocked that they sprinted down Broadway and had to be tackled by onlookers. William Wright, department sergeant, told the Morning Post, "When we drove up, the first thing I saw was 2 men leading another man out. The last man, with most of the flesh burned from his arms in big chunks and his face a mass of blood and blisters, sat down in the road and screamed so you could hear him for blocks. 'I'm dying, I'm dying. For God's sake, why won't someone do something for me?' he kept calling. Then I backed my truck out to a hydrant, and that was all I saw of it for a while." The firemen deployed their hoses against the flames and began to control the fire so that more bodies could be brought out. On the north side of the building, they broke through the outer wall in a desperate attempt to rescue the trapped seamstresses. They found all the women dead inside, including Carrie Bell Weiss, age 20, Ella Taylor, age 19, and Effie Harkins, whose 2 orphaned children would become staples of subsequent newspaper coverage. The Post notes that while the ambulances were en route, private automobiles were commandeered, and the injured were loaded into them. The Denver General Hospital was swamped. Other victims were routed to the Presbyterian Hospital. The bodies began to appear in the city morgue, but identification was difficult as their features were blackened and charred beyond recognition. Effie Harkins was only identified by a piece of leather shoe that still clung to her foot. Ambulance crews were unable to discern burned corpses from debris. One stretcher crew hauled off a burned mass that turned out to just be a barrel of glue. The flames were mostly contained by about 1 p.m. By the end of the first day, the death toll sat at 4. By press time on the 22nd, the number had risen to 9. All told, 11 people perished as a result of the explosion, and dozens more were injured. Don M. was flying up from Colorado Springs in a company plane at the time of the fire. He arrived on the scene in the midst of the cleanup, still in his flight suit and goggles.
Arriving alongside him was Arapahoe County District Attorney Joel Stone. Before the flames had even fully been extinguished, Stone called for the impaneling of a coroner's jury. The 6-man jury was sworn in that afternoon at a nearby mortuary, standing over the first 4 bodies pulled from the ruins. But before we look into the hearings, let's learn a little about some of the victims. Ella Taylor, who lived at 3801 South Broadway, was one of the first bodies to be pulled from the ruins. The 19-year-old lived at home with her parents, 2 sisters, and 3 brothers. She had planned to attend Moody Bible Institute in Chicago in the fall. 2,000 people attended her funeral at Englewood Baptist Church. An eagle rock made a slow circle overhead. Reverend Joshua Gravitt was quoted as saying, "Jesus knew what Ella never knew, the wrath of God. That holocaust that swept Ella to the Lord shall call us to higher devotion. There's pain, but there's peace in the midst of fire." Effie Harkins of 3256 South Sherman Street, originally from Cortez, provided for her 72-year-old mother Mary, as well as her 2 daughters, 8-year-old Mildred and 6-year-old Naomi. The girls were orphaned by their 32-year-old mother's death, as their father Will, a cook in Denver, had abandoned them years earlier. Oh, that's it. Gertrude Jarrett of 1500 South Logan Street had 2 grown daughters and a 14-year-old son who attended Englewood High School, and had 2 grown daughters who lived nearby. Her husband had died not long before Christmas in 1920. Her family remembers that she once operated a small turkey farm in what is now Cherry Hills Village. She limped from a broken ankle that was still healing. During the fire, she tried to climb out the window of the sewing room, but when Supervisor Francis Sterling tried to pull her through, the flesh of her arms came off in his hands. Her body was so badly burned that she had to be identified by her false teeth. Her death would end up being the basis of the charges the company's management would later face. Carrie Belle Weiss, 20 years old, lived with her sister and brother-in-law at 3055 South Acoma. She had moved to Englewood from Montrose only 6 weeks before the fire, hoping to save up money to travel. Her corpse was found beneath a crumbled cement wall. She was only identifiable in the morgue by the process of elimination because her body was the smallest. Carl Mosley, 22 years old, lived with his family at 3319 South Grant Street. His family had arrived the previous fall from Kentucky. His brother Seth was injured in the blast, and his sister Ora, a stenographer, had watched the scene unfold from the administration office. Many witnesses recalled him repeatedly charging back into the burning building to search for more people. Jack Nordstrom of 2005 South Gilpin Street was the youngest victim at age 15. He lived long enough to tell a reporter that he had tried to escape, but found the in-swinging doors swarmed with people. His mother collapsed when she found his body at Denver General. Albert McGarry was a 24-year-old who lived at 1440 Clarkson Street. He had only worked at the plant for 2 weeks and had moved here from Vincennes, Indiana. The McGarry family were early settlers of southern Indiana, and many features in the region still bear their name. His tombstone reads simply, "Our Son." Robert Holmes, 31 years old, lived at 3269 South Sherman Street. He left behind a widow, and his body was sent home to Hennessy, Oklahoma. Jesse Perry, 37 years old, lived at 4465 South Bannock with her husband Emery, who was injured in the explosion. George Raw, 25, lived at the Irvington Hotel. Other tenants there remembered that he used to play love songs on the piano in the lobby. He's buried in Colorado Springs. The final victim I don't have a photo of. I have not been able to find one. His name was Ross Scott. He was 32, and he lived at the Monroe Hotel. His body was sent home to the tiny town of Agra, Kansas. His tombstone indicates that at age 21 he served in Company G of the 60th Infantry, which waged fierce battle in France in 1918 as part of the 100-day Meuse-Argonne offensive, which killed more than 50,000 people but secured the Western Front. The coroner's jury, overseen by District Attorney Stone. Oh, actually, I want to pause here. This is a really remarkable photo that has never before been associated with Alexander history. This was sent to me just last night by Deb Wilson of Grand Junction. She is the great-granddaughter of Gertrude Jarrett. And her uncle, Paul, is here with us today. He's sitting right up front here, and we're going to be hearing from him a little bit later. This is a fascinating photo, and and Deb sent me a few others which are just really marvelous. I mean, there's some of the more significant artifacts in Englewood history to come out in a while, if you ask me. Anyway, this appears to be the entire upholstery crew of the plant at the time of the blast. These 5 women that I've been able to identify, all 5 of them were killed. There's a 6th woman in the back who I can't identify, but what I do know is that news accounts say that there were 5 women in the upholstery shop the day of the blast. They all died, and like I said, I mean, that's, you know, here they are. I mean, it's amazing. Here's Gertrude, that's Paul's grandma, with her arms around the shoulders of Jessie Perry. So yeah, just, you know, and they appear to be standing in front of a row of aircraft wings. So really, like I said, I mean, just remarkable stuff. There's a few others that I've got at the end of the presentation. But yeah, really, really cool stuff. And the other photos also, there's a lot of like background detail. It's neat stuff. Like I said, I just got this last night, so let's see, where are we here? So the coroner's jury, overseen by District Attorney Stone and Deputy County Coroner Albert Teed, was in session by the afternoon of the blast. Stone told reporters that he believed the blast was the result of the most flagrant case of criminal negligence I have ever seen. It was quickly learned that the dope shop was not covered by the company's insurance policy, as no underwriter would insure it. Again, pausing here, this is the sewing room, sometimes called the upholstery shop. This is where the 5 women died. You can see in this diagram of the way things were on the day of the blast. The only exit to the room, there were a bunch of airplane wings stacked right outside. The other door was blocked by machinery and equipment. The only way out of this room was through the rest of the building. There was no fire exit to the exterior from that interior room.
Can I ask a quick question? Where were the blasts?
It's not entirely clear where exactly the blasts were. As best they can tell, yeah, it was a sparking fan motor threw off a little spark into a pan of dope. Most accounts say there were 3 explosions. The second one being particularly large. The dope itself was actually stored in barrels that were outside the building and was piped in. But that said, I mean, as we'll get into later, the place was just soaked with the stuff. The second explosion, the biggest one, may have been, there was a huge air compressor tank. The compressors themselves were outside, but the tank was inside the building, and that may have accounted for the largest of the explosions. Okay, so let's see. Here's the Alexander brothers at the age, roughly the age they would have been at the time of the blast. Let's see here. Over the next several days of testimony, a story emerged of mounting danger and concern regarding the dope shed. State Factory Inspector Moses Alexander, no relation to the brothers, testified that he had inspected the buildings the previous December and found them inadequately ventilated and without proper exits, noting in-swinging doors often partially blocked by machinery. He said he issued an order to the company to fix the issues, but no action was ever taken. Assistant Superintendent Ernest Robinson told the jury he had forbidden his wife from taking a job in the dope shed, saying he worried a fire would kill her if the thick fumes didn't first. A chemist testified that the company was using an outdated, but much cheaper, form of silver nitrate dope that had a flash point of only 140 degrees, and that it could combust merely from being exposed to sunlight. Newer forms in use in industrial applications by that time had flash points of 300 degrees, but were more expensive. Francis Sterling, the 27-year-old floor supervisor who had attempted to save Gertrude Jarrett, testified that he once saw a doped wing catch fire from being sandpapered. Another time he saw a wing go up in flames after a cigarette butt bounced off it. James Chelf, who worked in the fuselage department, testified that everything in the dope room was saturated in nitrate dope. He said that workers' overalls were never washed and were so stiff with dope that they could almost stand up on their own. Chelf recalled an earlier deadly fire at the plant in January of 1927, in which he tried in vain to rescue two young men, 23-year-old Raymond Rogers and 22-year-old Clayton Kennelly, who were killed after they dropped a barrel of lin oil, which exploded in the basement. Chelf recalled that Jadon docked him an hour's pay for the rescue attempt. Jessie Perry gave a statement as she lay dying in a bed at Denver General Hospital that she and other seamstresses in the sewing room had pleaded with management for a fire exit from the sewing room. I'm going to go back into, there we go, seamstresses. She said she was told to deal with it until the company moved to the Springs. She and several other seamstresses then held an after-hours fire drill of their own to see if they could climb through the windows. It was found that while the younger girls could make it, the larger and older women could not. The most damning testimony came from Englewood city officials. Tense and angry witness was borne by Englewood Fire Chief William Hanlon, who testified that he and his whole department knew the Alexander campus was a fire trap, particularly the dope shed. Hanlon said he toured the dope shed a year before and found the air thick with fumes and only one window open. Don M. told Hamlin at the time that the windows and doors were only open when the outside temperature exceeded 80 degrees in order to keep the dope flowing properly. Hamlin said he had issued stern warnings to the Alexanders in each of the previous years that their factory was dangerously unsafe. He said the Alexanders had a policy that employees were only to call the fire department if their own internal firefighting efforts failed, and that on the morning of the fire, he and his crew were already en route to the fire before a single call had come in from the plant itself. Hamlin said that after the 1927 fire, his department had drafted a resolution that he presented to City Council to compel the Alexanders to update their plant and comply with modern fire codes, but the resolution died in a committee. James McCord, a former city councilman, testified that the fire department's resolution died because the Alexanders themselves threatened to move out of Englewood if it were enacted. In fact, the council passed a resolution exempting the Alexander factory from any further fire safety efforts.
Is that what the immunity resolution is there?
I'm not sure where
In the middle there?
the middle. Right, yes, exactly, yeah. Let's see here. McCord admitted that the exemption as passed was written verbatim by the Alexander brothers themselves. The resolution read in part that the factory sported a full fire sprinkler system, fire exits, and that regular fire drills were held, none of which was found to be true. McCord said that City Council had been led on a tour of the plant by Don M. to demonstrate the factory's safety, but that City Council had not seen every building and were not even familiar with Colorado Fire Code requirements. Hamlin said that after the fire department's ordinance failed, Jadon brought a box of cigars to the firehouse to try to bury the hatchet. Employees testified that the building's 2 exterior doors opened inward and every door was crowded with airplane wings and debris. They remembered only one small fire extinguisher in the building. They said the walls dripped with dope and dope accumulated a half-inch thick on the wooden floor. Neither of the Alexander brothers testified, both pleading their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. Work resumed at the plant on Saturday. The company had erected large canvas tents in which to resume doping wings, but they were shut down by factory inspector Alexander. On Monday morning, Al Mooney, who 2 years prior had designed the first successful Eagle Rock, called a company-wide meeting. He said that the public was only getting one side of the story and called for a collection to be taken up to run ads in area newspapers pledging employee support of the company. He collected $300 from the crowd, and 266 employees ended up signing their name to a petition supporting the company. They were then docked 15 minutes pay for participating in the meeting. An inspection by Arapahoe County Sheriff John Haynes found that the whole plant exhibited highly dangerous conditions, and District Attorney Stone filed an injunction shutting down the factory for at least a month. After a long and contentious meeting that concluded after 1 in the morning, Don M. announced that the company would immediately flee Englewood and occupy their unfinished campus in Colorado Springs. He ordered every employee roused at 3 in the morning and managed to assemble 75 moving trucks. Tuesday was a frenzy of activity as hundreds of people packed up the entire operation and made numerous trips back and forth to the Springs. Upon arrival, the company set up administration offices in an abandoned church. The art department used a dance hall, and the film service department occupied a stable. The canvas tents were set up to complete the wing doping work. J. Don, who had been at an air show in Detroit with his wife Gertrude, finally returned on Wednesday morning. They were thronged by reporters as they sped through the lobby of Union Station, but Don M. shuttled them to a waiting car. On Wednesday afternoon, D.A. Stone announced the charges. There's one more of the moving day.
Who took those pictures?
You know, I believe that, I mean, there were an awful lot more reporters and photographers per capita back then. There's not that many of us left anymore. But they could be all over the place back then. But this was a huge story. I mean, there were multiple daily papers back then. There was also the Denver Morning Post. They were all over this for days on end. So D.A. Stone announced the charges. Voluntary manslaughter. Charged were J. Don, Don M., Ray Duncan, Secretary-Treasurer, Clarence Hornaday, Superintendent, and Benjamin Winton, foreman of the dope plant. All paid a $2,000 bond. Now remember, the inflation means a $2,000 bond. That's about $28,000 bond. The charge was based on the death of Jarrett, who had attempted to climb out a window but had fallen back into the flames. Here's J. Don. This is, yeah, that's Secretary. They did these weird illustrations back then. They're strange, but here's J. Don going, ooh boy. On February 29th, 1929, 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Stone announced that he was dropping the manslaughter charges. So this is just shy of a year later. The manslaughter charges were dropped, and that the 5 accused would plead guilty to 4 counts of violating state factory laws. They were fined a cumulative total of $1,000 and given a suspended 90-day jail sentence. The charges were failure to provide sufficient means of escape, failure to have doors that opened outward, failure to provide proper ventilation, and failure to provide proper sanitation. Stone said, "In view of the Alexander Company's attitude in taking care of the persons injured in the unfortunate explosion, which is not compulsory by law, I decided to dismiss the manslaughter charges providing they would pay fines. Their conviction on a manslaughter charge was extremely doubtful, and a trial would have meant a very large expense to the county." The Englewood factory was abandoned. I'm going to pause here too. This is the first this is the first president's letter in the company newsletter after the blast. You know, this part in particular, he's talking about the aftermath of the blast. This is J. Don, and he's talking about the aftermath. He says, "Then came to all of us the hate of our neighbors with their desire to destroy our business family. When they threatened to close us and cancel our thousands of contracted obligations, you bravely, under the efficient direction of Brother Don M., worked day and night to move." Anyhow, yeah, it's...
Go ahead and finish reading. I don't know if they can see.
Okay. The move was an industrial masterpiece. Men and women without any but routine authority were thrown upon their own resources to make their own decisions. Personal comforts were forgotten, fatigue and self-sacrifice not thought of. Everyone rose to the emergency and used their heads as well as their hands. Not a single serious mistake was made. On arrival at the Springs, the same spirit continued and is continuing. This same spirit of cooperation wins battles, overcomes all obstacles, and is the spirit with which you and I will march on to great industrial victory. Again, I thank you. With a smile, J. Don.
Did they pay for any of those funerals?
No, they did not pay for the funerals. Let's see. The Englewood factory was abandoned. The dope shed was never rebuilt. The administration building reverted to its original owner, the estate of Jacob C. Jones, Englewood's first mayor. It became Englewood City Hall, and fun fact, we don't know exactly when it was torn down. It appears to have been sometime in the mid to late 50s. Alexander Industries blossomed in the Springs, though the Depression would devastate aircraft sales. The last Alexander plane was built in 1932, only 7 years after the first Eagle Rock lumbered skyward. The film business continued until the 1960s and included a couple of feature films. The Alexander campus in the Springs was a major tourist attraction for many years, but today the site is absorbed into suburban sprawl. J. Don died in 1953, Don M. in 1971. They were inducted into the Colorado Aviation Hall of Fame in 1970. Today there are very few marks on the landscape to remember the days when biplanes rolled onto Broadway, or the place where 11 people died gruesome, preventable deaths. I will say one of the very, very few markers on the landscape to remember is literally right outside this patio. There's a tile in the ground that mentions, that shows the an eagle rock. It says films to planes or something like that. One of the very few. Let's see here. Interestingly, also, when you leave here tonight, take a look across the street, because you guys know the old South Broadway Tropicals building? I can't remember what's in there now. If you look at the top of that building, there are several, the shape of the building is a Spanish mission style, and it has several small arched windows in the top. It was designed to be a reflection or imitation of this building, which is no longer there. It was designed to sort of reflect the style. So yeah, when you leave here, look left and you'll see it.
What year was that?
I have no idea. I have not looked up when that was built. That's a good question. One of the fun things that's happened recently as part of this project is I've been put in touch with the Jarrett family, the descendants of Gertrude, who died in the blast and was the basis of the manslaughter charges. And I'm going to have Paul come up here in a few minutes and share some family stories, but I also wanted to share something that was sent to me by his niece here, Deb in Grand Junction. You've already seen that photo. And these are some of the other photos that she sent to me last night. So there's another one, that's the same gals. These all appear to have been taken in fairly short order in one day. So you can see, this last one, there they are standing by the wings. In this one, here's the wings over here, but they've moved over here by this truck. So then here's another one, and I'm not sure, that might be barrels of dope right there that they're sitting on. If so, that's rather ominous. This is another one. These are some really cool family shots. I would love, as we take this project forward, one thing I would love to do is really track down some more of the families and descendants and see what other kind of family stories and photos they might have to share. This is Gertrude's husband, Walter, and who died in 1920, and this is, help me out here, Paul, who are we looking at here?
The oldest girl is Dorothy.
Dorothy, okay.
And then, I got that was Helen.
That's Helen.
Dorothy.
Dorothy.
And that's my dad, Walter Jr.
Okay. Dad, Walter Jr., there you go. This is in the blizzard of 1913. In Englewood, yeah. Incidentally, it was a wet year. There was a big flood that year. Some of the best photos of early Broadway are from 1913 because during the flood somebody bothered to haul a camera out and they thought it was worth using a plate to film on. There is Gertrude teaching Sunday school. This is right here. It says Englewood Community Church. I don't know exactly where that is. Some of the old timers might know. But it'd be interesting to find out.
Does anyone know?
This is a great one. I just love this one. I wanted to end on this one, and I wanted to have this one up here as Paul was sharing with us because this is Gertrude and Walter around 1900. So that means Englewood would not be an incorporated city for 3 years after this was taken. That means Gertrude here is about 30. And Paul might be able to tell us how old that means Walter was at the time, but just what an atmospheric and beautiful photo. If I just came across this in any other context, it would be a great photo, but connected to this history, it's even more powerful.
No idea where it is?
No, not exactly clear. Paul might be able to shed a little light, but anyhow, before we do that, I want to say there are absolutely a lot of unanswered questions on this topic. This is by no means a settled research topic. Every direction you go here, there's more to find out. About the history of the company, the people involved, some of the big questions. One of the primary sources of information about this topic is a book by John DeVries that he wrote in the 80s. He was a He was an aviation fanatic who wrote the history of the company. And he mentions that during the months that the Alexanders were awaiting trial, that the Alexander brothers were spreading rumors in local newspapers that the fire may have been started as an arson by a jilted, jealous husband of one of the seamstresses who was killed. There's absolutely no basis to support that, none. But frankly, I can't find that corroborated outside of DeVries' book. Interestingly, though, the City of Englewood's website, which lists a timeline of Englewood history, for the entry for this, they say that the fire started under suspicious circumstances. I don't know if that's an allusion to those rumors. It could be, it's not quite clear. The other piece is sort of the political response. There's a mention in some of the news articles from the week of the blast that Colorado State Senator Frederick Dickerson planned on introducing legislation that would allow factory inspectors the ability to shut down factories on site for non-compliance with building and fire codes, which had not been the case previously. Now, there was a state factory inspection reform bill that was passed by the General Assembly in 1929, but it wasn't introduced by Frederick Dickerson, and I haven't yet been able to track down. I would love to see some of the testimony before the General Assembly that was given, because, being a journalist, I can't say correlation equals causation, so I can't say definitively that the 1929 law reform was as a result of this. One interesting thing we had at the 2:30 presentation, we had a speaker, Dick Crack. If there's anyone, real authority on deadly fires in the Denver area, he's it. He wrote the book Denver in Flames. And what he was saying was, to recognize, among other things, I'm paraphrasing, but to recognize that in the 1920s, deadly structure fires were far more common than they are today. Hotels, offices, all kinds of places. However, this one does stand out because it was particularly deadly. Let's see, the last thing that I want to read before I hand this over is, Deb in Grand Junction, Gertrude's great-granddaughter, sent me this last night. She writes, "My grandmother," so Gertrude's daughter, Dorothy Gertrude Jarrett, later Herb, was living in Englewood on South Logan during the blast. Her husband was working for the streetcar company. She was at home with her daughters when she or a neighbor spotted a huge plume of smoke in the direction of Alexander Industries. She left her daughters, 6, 5, and 3 years old, with a neighbor and went to the plant. I am not sure how she got there, but when she did, she saw the magnitude of it and the efforts being taken to save those inside. I was always told that she arrived in time to see someone trying to rescue her mother, Gertrude, and saw her fall back into the flames and was aware that she was dying. Her sister Helen Jarrett Page had recently married and was living in Julesburg at the time. It was decided that their brother John, Paul's father, would live with my grandmother and grandfather until he finished school. I heard many stories through the years of my mom, her siblings, and Uncle John. He was like their big brother. My grandparents left Englewood in 1935 and moved to Florissant, Colorado, where they owned a store and ran the post office. As I said, the incident was such a horrific event that it was rarely talked about. Gertrude was rarely talked about. I imagine it was just too painful, and I am sure that my grandmother suffered from undiagnosed PTSD as a result. With that, Paul, would you mind? Do you feel like coming up and sharing a little bit?
Please.
Not much to share.
That's if you just want to, we talked the other day about some stories about your father talking about stealing an Eagle Rock and so forth. Do you want to come up and tell that?
Well, I certainly knew less than what I did.
Get a little closer.
I found out a lot more than I had ever known about the history of that, other than that there was a fire and an explosion that killed my grandmother, but that was basically the end of it. And David brought a lot of that to light to us, the other things. But my dad grew up here in Englewood and had a lot of good friends here that were up into, and I knew their kids also. One thing my dad told me back in high school is he kind of let me in on it. He didn't want me to feel bad if I was getting in trouble. That happens to every age. And that him and Max Eggleston, his son Gray was in my class of 1960, and Barbara Metzger's class also. And him and Bert somebody, I can't remember his name, and another guy, they went to Bert's house late one night, rolled his dad's new car out of the driveway. Now it took off to the airport. It was out on the other side of what is I-25 now, the Englewood Airport. They wanted to build an ice boat. So they hooked up to an airplane to haul it off so they could take the engine off and put it on a boat on the ice lakes. And they were coming around the corner with it attached and made it too sharp of a corner and put a hole through his dad's car. Then had to get it back, abandoned the airplane, had to sneak the car back up into the driveway and find out some way to cover the story. Yeah, they were always doing something that sounds like. Oh, he was a fireman. He was a lieutenant in the fire department, volunteers. And
Which department?
Englewood. And I always wondered if maybe it was something to do with that fire, the explosion that made him get into it, but I have no idea. And my brother was a paid Englewood fireman for 35 or 40 years, something like that. Oh yes, there's the Englewood Firemen's Picnic. They had one every year, and picnics and fire conventions every year for the whole state. And there was an explosion at a picnic here in town, and my younger brother and my dad were both burned in that out of a propane explosion. Nothing too serious. Oh. Bill, he was a class of 62.
Bill, wait, so everybody knows who you are. There you go.
Were you in the car that night in the airplane?
Say that again, Doug?
Oh, I was wondering if Phil was in the car with that trying to tow the airplane.
My head flew in
Okay, yeah.
I have a question for David. When people hear that Englewood was in the early 1900s home to a large aircraft manufacturing plant, that seems like quite an achievement. And one would think, well, that was a good thing because look at all the employment opportunities they provided. And you know, a lot of good things could come out of that. But what most people don't know is the downside of that story of how poorly the Alexander brothers cared for their employees. I'm sure that came to your attention, David, as you wrote this story, as you did the research, that they were not such good guys after all, and yet they are a significant part of our city's history. So, are there any other questions?
Yeah, Matt.
So, DIA, Concourse B, right around gate 43,
Yeah.
there's an Alexander Eagle Rock hanging from the ceiling there.
Yes, there sure is. Matt points out that there is an Alexander Eagle Rock hanging in Concourse B at DIA.
is that one that was made here in Colorado, or in Englewood, or was that made in Colorado Springs?
No, I am not 100% on the number of surviving Englewood-built Eagle Rocks. The one that's hanging in Concourse B at DIA is one of the Colorado Springs-built ones. Generally, your rule of thumb for determining which one it is if they had an inline or radial engine. Most of the ones built in the Springs had a radial engine, so big, you know, on the front of the plane. I don't have somewhere in here. I have a picture of one, but this is an inline engine. You can see all the cylinders are in a row here, and going all the way back to the very beginning, somewhere in here. Okay, so this is a Colorado Springs built one right here. See how the engine, big circle of cylinders around the propeller there. So that more or less is your rule of thumb when you run across one. There was an Eagle Rock. There was an Englewood built Eagle Rock for a long time at the Wings Over the Rockies Museum out at the old Lowry Air Force Base. That plane, if I'm not mistaken, is now down at the Pueblo Wisebroad Museum. And so as far as I've been able to figure out, there may still be at least one flying Englewood built Eagle Rock, and it belongs to a guy in Ontario in Canada. I'm not really set up to show it right now because you couldn't hear the sound. The sound is a great part. There is a video on YouTube. There's 2 videos on YouTube of Alexander Eagle Rocks flying. One is a Springs built one, and the other one is a restored one from Englewood. And I love this video. You know, I didn't want to mess with the whole sound thing, but it's cool because I mean, you hear this like sputtery old 1920s motor engine firing up, and you know, you see these things. They look so graceful and everything, but listening to that engine, that like you know, you really hear that like 90 horsepower. You know, so there. Beyond that. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. It'd be really interesting to kind of try and track down where all the surviving Eagle Rocks are. Yeah, CJ.
I have 2 questions. The first one, what is a typical plane horsepower now?
I can answer that.
Yes,
Okay,
Matt.
Matt.
Okay, so well, actually, to use, for example, a Mooney aircraft, which the company actually still exists to this day. Al Mooney, it's actually a Chinese-owned company, but interesting history there. But anyway, a normal, there's 2 different categories of aircraft. There's a light sport aircraft, and there's a normal general aviation aircraft, I guess. General aviation aircraft is about 190 horsepower, although they can be as low as like a Cessna. You see the high-wing aircraft. I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain, but a Cessna could be as low as 140 horsepower. But with Colorado and the altitude here, there's something called density altitude. And that requires a little bit more power here because the equivalent altitude starting is higher, and it takes more energy effectively and more power to compensate for that. So to get off the ground, yeah. So 190 horsepower is pretty typical for a small general aviation aircraft. Now in the light sport category, the planes are a lot lighter. Those are maybe 120 to 130 horsepower, but those are smaller, much smaller planes, like 2-seaters usually.
Thank you. The second question was,
Yes.
how did you and Reed get involved in this topic?
I'm sorry. Well, you know, I mean, I started this. I mean, I've actually been.
Repeat my question.
Sorry. Oh, how did we get interested in this? Well, you know, many years ago. A long time ago, I mean, not long after the city of Englewood first put up their history website, there's just, you know, there's this chronology of Englewood history, and it's all this, like, nice little stuff about, like, you know, when this house was built or something. And then there's this one item in 1928, it says, 11 people were killed in a terrible explosion at the Englewood, at this biplane factory. I'm like, what? And so I Googled it, and I found next to nothing, and I looked around at the library, and I just couldn't find hardly any information on this. And this presentation kind of, you know, this is really, as far as I can tell, I mean, with a couple of sort of loose exceptions, this is the first real in-depth narrative of this event that anyone's written. yeah, I mean, it's just this is a project that is cobbled together from news reports, from government documents, from internal company records, you know, all kind of putting together a narrative. And I mean, it's an awful lot like writing a news story in that sense of taking all these data points and turning them into a story. But unfortunately, you know, the overwhelming majority of people involved in any way are long dead, so it kind of complicates it. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
It's not a question, it's a comment. So there's a 1929 Eagle Rock with a radial engine that was flying as recently as 2014. It was donated to Wings Over the Rocky Museum. They're currently storing it. Right now, under construction, it's annexed to the Wings Museum. It's going to be at Centennial Airport. This aircraft will be there in flying condition. Maybe this summer, early fall.
Wow. Very, very cool. I don't know if anybody couldn't hear that, Wings Over the Rockies is working on restoring a 1929 Eagle Rock to flying condition, and you said as early as this summer it might be in the air?
Well, I don't know when the airplane will be flying, but I know the new facility will be open. It'll be at Centennial Airport, right at kind of runway 28.
Okay.
Make sure to tell us.
Yeah, well, and yeah, and by the way, I mean, you know, Ellis has been following the story of the Centennial, the museum annex over there. So read your Englewood Herald. It'll be in there. All right, englewoodherald.net. By the way, yeah.
Is your research published anywhere?
You can find this at the moment only on my website, which is davidgilbertwrites.com. By the way, fun fact, I've got a pile of business cards back there on the table. I've got both my work business card for my work with the Herald and the Independent, as well as my sort of personal freelance business card. So if anybody wants to hire me and pay me big bucks to do this stuff.
You will take
And a follow-up.
Yeah.
Are any of the Alexander family still living, or do they have a relationship in Colorado?
So, I don't know how much of is remaining as far as the family itself. There was the film business kind of like petered along even after the company closed. For a while there was an Alexander video company down in Colorado Springs that was doing VHS to DVD transfers of people's old home movies and stuff. And then that turned into another company. The name escapes me right now, but oddly enough, within the company's name is within that like logo, the little filigree on the outside that's in all of the Alexander materials. So they at least kept this weird little graphic design element. So, but as far as the family, I really don't know. I haven't looked into that much. It's kind of hard to like want to go to a family and be talking to them about their horrible industrial accident their forebears caused. So.
How did you get into this?
David's my buddy. He started up a lot of this research, and at a certain point he just kind of brought me in on it to help flesh it out a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Got a couple more questions.
For those of you who want to pick up one of David's business cards and hire him for those big bucks, I've already offered to pay him twice what we did last year for his presentation here.
Yeah, I know. So we had another question.
If you'll talk to me afterwards, I may have a lead on the name of the sixth lady.
Okay, great.
Oh.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I love about.
Tell us what he said.
He said that you may have a lead for us on the name of the sixth woman in the photo of the seamstresses, which is right there.
Where'd you get all those from?
All these are mostly from news coverage at the time. I believe mostly the Denver Post. But yeah, no, that would be great, and that's that's what I really love about doing presentations like this. At the 231, we had a guy whose dad worked in the factory. It's just really cool to be sort of researching this as this very far away, very distant thing, and then to come here and have it really come to life thanks to some of the folks who come and attend. Any other questions?
Take his business card.
No, okay. Yeah, that's right. All right. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you guys all coming.